And we are live. Welcome to our first ever episode of Story Islands, sponsored by Stornaway. In a world that is increasingly obsessed by algorithms and data, this is a safe space for serendipity and random connection. Steve Jobs famously said you can only trace the dots backwards. And in that spirit, this podcast, we try and talk to people whose journeys have navigated that complex space of media, innovation, and creativity. We ask them to share 5 story islands, people, places, themes from their life and work, and then we navigate them, or rather, I try and navigate it with them in order or out of order. So to find the connections, and perhaps by not taking the linear, time-based route, we might uncover some unexpected things along the way. If you're listening to this as a linear podcast, you will experience it as it unfolds for us. But if you're watching the interactive Stornaway, you can choose which order you move through the story islands. I'm so excited about our first ever guest on Story Islands. Margaret Heffernan is a writer-director with incredible books about business, creativity, and innovation. She started life as a radio producer at the BBC, but she's had an incredible career as a multi-time CEO of large technology companies in the US. She has sat on boards, she teaches entrepreneurship, mentors executives, and she's currently a professor of practice at the University of Bath School of Management in the UK. She is passionate about all things education and creativity and how that intersects with business. So she is our perfect first guest. Her latest book, Embracing Uncertainty, is about how businesses could benefit from studying artists, and includes a wonderful anecdote about her experience casting the actor Alan Rickman in a musical, which we might get into later. For myself, as an artist who's had a rather fast track experience of becoming a creative technology entrepreneur, I can't wait for my conversation. So I'm going to bring into the studio Margaret Heffernan. As if by magic, she is launched in. Hello, Margaret. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to this.
I mean, what's so extraordinary is that your career has navigated what we call story islands, very, very different worlds. That's been your whole life, really, is moving between these different worlds. And for the audience's benefit, I'm going to just up front name your story islands that have been chosen by you with no guide from us. Margaret has chosen the desert island. We'll dive into that in a bit more context. Solitude, independence, reflection, recharging. The social island, collaboration. The creative island, theatre, radio drama, TV, tech, which I talked about a little bit. The business island, organizations, what is success, what is failure? We'll definitely be diving into that one. And the home island, I love the home island, which is where do you want to go today? I think we have to start with the home island. So,
okay,
where are you, and kind of where do you want to go today? As in, not in this podcast, but sort of where are you finding yourself at this point in your career with all these books behind you in the world that we live in? That's a big question, but it might be a nice place to start.
No, it's a good question. I mean, where I am today physically is at home in my office, which is, I would say, I mean, it's certainly where I write. It's the only place where I can do, I think, really sustained what I think of as proper writing. But where am I today? I think is, I mean, I feel like I'm sort of teetering on a precipice in terms of what I want to spend my time on. So there's a lot of stuff that I have been doing that I think I probably want to do not at all, or a lot less of, which is, generally speaking, strategic advice for very large organizations. And a lot of stuff that I'm sort of wading into, which is relatively new, which is certainly more creative. It's more full of ambiguity. And it's actually giving myself permission to move towards the stuff I really love doing and the people I really love working with.
And it's where you started. Yeah.
And it's where I started. So I think that's kind of interesting. It's, it raises all sorts of questions like, why did I ever leave? But I'm not sure that I definitely don't mind having left. I think I feel I want to go back because I feel that the time I spent in the arts working with artists holds a lot of the, let's say, clues or indicators of what we need right now. I feel in the world today, and this is businesses as well as, countries and geopolitics and all that horror, we're truly stuck. There's a huge, we're facing gigantic problems, and the quality of imagination and creativity being brought to those problems is really undernourished. And I think that could be because we are imaginatively and creatively undernourished. We're being fed a lot of processed food, and it's not doing us a lot of good. So, and I feel absolutely uncertain about this because I sometimes think, oh, for God's sake, Margaret, really, you think the solution to the world is for us all to become more artistic? That's ridiculous. But on the other hand, I think, yeah, but doing more of the same feels even more ridiculous. And
it's interesting because through your work, oh, sorry.
No,
I was going to say,
I just think the quality of thinking that we're seeing from people we expect to have ideas is so poor that it's like we're all malnourished. We are intellectually and imaginatively malnourished, and we're not going to be able to run the marathon that life is going to require of us if we don't start eating better food.
And I think it's interesting because that's been a theme, the theme of what you say in your new book, deep hanging out, kind of creating space for creative thought within organizations has been with you throughout your life. I wonder what you've seen that's changed, that the leadership you feel, is it that leaderships of those large organizations are now set up in a way where it's almost impossible to feed in that kind of nourishment? Or it'd be interesting to know how the food system has changed in that respect.
How it's broken down. Well, I think it's a couple of things. I've worked with a number of senior leaders who, they're super bright people. They're really committed. They're very energetic. They definitely are people of goodwill, and they just don't know what to do. They're not bad people, but they feel hemmed in by so many expectations and so many demands, and they are so intensely busy that they can't get out of the kind of loop that they find themselves stuck in. It's like they're stuck in a one-way system and they can't find their way out. And I certainly try to help them. And I think from time to time, at least they tell me I have helped them, but I don't feel that they're brave enough to break the cycle as energetically as probably they want and we need. So, and typically one of the ways this manifests, which I think is really interesting and psychologically telling, is that they will complain that the people around them are not imaginative or creative enough. And I'm sure that's true for all kinds of reasons. But I suspect, if I start complaining that the people around me are dull and boring, what I'm really saying is, Margaret, you're becoming dull and boring to yourself. So I think we're stuck on quite a profound level, that neither AI or a little bit of GDP growth is going to fix.
Yeah, that's a very powerful thought. We're becoming boring to ourselves, especially with that idea of the AI loop feeding back to us who we are. And I think one of the ideas of Story Islands is that we can now seamlessly sail over to another island. And again, I think one of the things you talk very powerfully about with the way that creativity works is that it can't be straitjacketed. It cannot be. You talk particularly in your book around how the idea that an artist is led by their curiosity. And I think that resonates with what you're saying, which is that at some level, if we lose our curiosity, we lose our creativity at some level. So I'm going to take
Absolutely.
us, and in that spirit, I'm going to take us to, would you want to choose the next island? Would you like to go social, business, or desert?
I don't care. I'll go anywhere. I'll go anywhere.
I think we should.
Uh,
I know that about you. That's why I chose you as my first guest. We'll go to let's go to business, because I think we should dive in a bit more there, and then we can come back to the recharging. And one of the two things you've written by the Business Island is what is success and what is failure. And I guess that idea that we are, if we talk about straitjacketing or linear progression, you know, all business owners are living in a world where they are having to navigate this need for forecasting. You've talked about that before, you know, this place between reality and imagined reality, about what numbers they're going to get to, how they're going to prove out their case, the data that's going to prove out their case. I'd love you to speak a bit more about that, and where you're seeing again that that's perhaps we're in a sort of crisis moment in that respect.
Yeah. Well, I see a lot of organizations really stuck in terms of being expected to keep doing what they always have done. And in a radically different environment, that strikes me as mad. Possibly the definition of madness. But, you know, I have both empathy with people in this position, but also frustration, which is everybody gets caught in an alibi loop. I would like to do something innovative, but the shareholders won't let me, the market won't let me, something won't let me. But there is this thing which I talk about called the status quo trap, which is if I just keep doing very well what I've always done before, I'll be safe. And I think what history shows us, and certainly what a lot of business history shows us, is that that may very well be the most dangerous thing you could possibly do, which is not to innovate. Strikes me as super dangerous right now. You know, the fossil fuel companies may be very happy that their shareholders are going to get tons of money, but in the long term, this will not work for them. You know, my husband, who's a research scientist, has this great mantra. The thing about science is you don't have to believe in it for it to be true. We cannot wish the climate crisis away, but deciding what we're just going to act as if it's not there is mad. And what's even worse is everybody can see that it's mad. I mean, this morning I was reading some data on the level of popular understanding and belief around the climate crisis. And one of the things that's most interesting is in the UK, about 83% of the population believes the climate crisis is man-made and it's a real thing and it's a gigantic risk and we should do things about it. Now, that's astonishing when the whole narrative is around climate denial, right? As if that's our problem. That is not our problem. Our problem is that we're not doing anything about it. And we say we're not doing anything about it because everybody will hate us if we do. But guess what? They won't. They hate us now because we're not doing anything about it. But they're not saying that. They're just waiting. They're waiting for people to demonstrate some leadership, a very fashionable word, but not a very, you know, prevalent reality. So I think, you know, I think we're in a moment where, and this is very counterintuitive, we're in a moment of uncertainty where actually you have to take bigger risks, not smaller ones. And this is absolutely not what I think anybody understands except artists, who typically at the peak of their, you know, fame and fortune will essentially walk off stage and do something else. You know, whether it's Dylan going electronic, whether it's, you know, Miles Davis taking up painting. I mean, whatever it may be, you know, these are gigantic risks, but they can't not do it. They can't live with themselves if they don't do it. And one of the reasons that these characters have such very, very long careers and very, very long reputations is because they don't fall into the status quo trap.
And would you say there are huge experience meeting different leaders and CEOs? You have seen people who carry both those qualities. Is it common in, is there a kind of rule that an entrepreneur has more creativity than someone who's grown up in organizations? I'm interested to know whether there's a cultural defining of that kind of sensibility.
That's a very, very good question. I can think of some business leaders who I think, if you look at their CV, they're not specifically entrepreneurial in the sense that they've gone from kind of major established institutions to another, but they have somehow remained entrepreneurial in their capacity to think differently and not to go with the crowd. And actually, that's the sort of the almost invisible leitmotif of their careers, which is they have had great success, but not by following what everybody else has done. And they don't stand out as radicals. They don't look like it. They don't sound like it. And they don't go overboard trying to emphasize how brilliantly different they are. But they do have a capacity to change early. And they do have a capacity to make changes without trumpeting it as a major thing. They just kind of quietly go ahead and do it. And that I find really impressive. That they're very quiet, deep thinkers.
I think that's really an interesting distinction, because obviously we do live in a place where there is a lot of shouting about how different people are and how and you mentioned, I remember you mentioned an experience with the Bank of England. I was very struck by that example. Can you just tell that anecdote for our audience?
So there are two Bank of England stories. One is about bringing speakers in, and the other one is an Uncharted about doing experiments. So which one do you mean?
Oh, interesting. I was thinking about bringing speakers in, but either will do. Whatever.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
Whatever suits the story island.
Yeah. So you can take the example of Andy Haldane when he was chief economist at the Bank of England. And you might not think, I mean, I certainly would not think, wow, the chief economist at the Bank of England must be a really daring, creative individual. That betrays my stereotyping and my biases, right? But the thing that really piqued my interest in Haldane was when I discovered that he was kind of famous within the bank for going on long walks and kind of just wandering around to try to get a sense of intuitive sense of what the mood of the country was. I would recommend this to everybody. I mean, I have to say at the moment in England, anybody who thinks we're not heading for a recession is definitely not doing a lot of wandering around. But one of the reason he did that is he said in any institution, you're going to get a lot of the same conversations, the same working assumptions, the same points of view. And he was constantly looking for different lenses or different windows through which to look at the world. And he found that incredibly helpful when he had to come to make big decisions, like decisions on interest rates and things like that. And then he thought, well, if this is really useful to me, maybe it'd really be useful to other people. And so he started bringing all sorts of artists and scientists and thinkers into the bank to do talks, because he just wanted people to experience the different modes of thinking that are possible. And he said this just set off a whole kind of chain reaction of different conversations in the bank. Now, it doesn't mean that somebody listening to the ballet dancer Tamara Rojo would instantly go away and rewrite the national budget. It's not as linear as that. But there might be something in the way that she's thinking about her work or what she's doing or how she's conveying a story that would help them to see something they'd never seen before. And that's really what you want when you're making decisions, which is not just the obvious data and the obvious choices, but different ways to think about the problem. And I think that's what entrepreneurs tend to bring to their work. But I think we have a lot of cliches around entrepreneurs, which is they're pale male, that they're typically ridiculously youthful, and their whole goal is to destabilize everything. I mean, first of all, the data suggests that the most successful entrepreneurs are not, adolescent young men. They're people who have quite a lot of business experience. There's a lot of data showing that women-owned businesses tend to last longer and create more jobs. And I think, that is, when I dug into that in my second book, I don't think that's because, there's something about our physiognomy that makes us intrinsically different. I think because we inhabit different roles in society, we see different things, we have a divergent perspective, and so therefore we see opportunities that others do not, or we see different ways of getting things done in ways that other people do not. And that diversity is phenomenally important to the entire social economic infrastructure.
Amazing. Yeah. And I'm hoping to talk, Martha Lane Fox has been talking very vocally about this recently, and about the kind of terrifying way in which particularly AI and tech is going more male, more, more masculine led. And I think, I think it's such an interesting, I'm going to move to the next story island. I'm going to use that as my boat to set off to the next story island, which is going to be, I think, probably the creative island, because I think something about what you're speaking to there is also the way in which creatives are forced to create work where there is a sort of structure that controls whether they get paid or not, and yet they are driven to navigate that world artfully. They are listening to the world around them and feeding that into that work, kind of in all the ways you're talking about. I think there's such interesting perspectives about how an artist might mirror an entrepreneur, and where those sort of serendipities are. You obviously your career has crossed across all media, so different kind of structures in which creativity as an industry thrives. I think I'm interested, as we move from the business island to the creative island, you've written lots of books, creativity is in your bones. How do you talk to people who might think, no, creativity lives over there, it's nothing to do with me? Because I feel like people get very confused about the industry of creative work versus being creative in your life and finding connections and looking outside the structure.
Yeah,
that was a long question.
Well, I think also people get very they're assaulted by stereotypes. This notion of creatives as lovies, is somehow different and weird and special, and they forget that everybody's born creative. And they forget to ask themselves, well, if I was creative once, what happened? Am I still? Could I still be? To which I would say the answer is definitely yes. And I think particularly they've been diverted by narratives of efficiency and scaling and predictability and certainty, which send them swimming away from more creative waters. And that's very much what my most recent book was about, which was saying, actually, it's only an uncertainty that new ideas are going to be found. If something's certain, that means we already know that. Don't go there. There's nothing fun to find there. It's an uncertainty that innovation is going to happen. It's where you're going to find new ideas, new approaches. And by the way, although that may make you super anxious, it's also going to be really interesting. So instead of just repeating yourself, which is where certainty comes from, wouldn't it be fun to go somewhere else and find some new ways of thinking and working and leading, instead of just dragging yourself into the office every day to do the same old thing because it gives you a level of comfort? I don't think an absence of anxiety is a glorious, energetic definition of fulfillment.
And presumably with so many people working from home, I think I've read some recent studies about the COVID effect on us, where we simultaneously people were picking up crocheting because they hadn't done it, or they were refinding these creative parts of themselves.
Yeah.
But it feels to me that the landscape we're in now is this kind of normalized staying at home, which obviously means less connection, less walking through the streets that you haven't been through before. And I guess, do you have an example, a particular example, I think you do in your book, of a kind of how the serendipity of walking through different places or putting yourself in different environments results in creative flow, if you like?
Well, I write in my book a lot about walking and wandering around and deep hanging out, partly because it's clearly indicated in the lives of virtually all artists. You know, that they go for walks without an agenda. They will follow their nose. They will explore things just because they're curious. I do think if you're not curious, it's incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to be creative. And it isn't that you're going in search of the thing, but because we know that, you know, in the best spirit of Stornaway, creativity is nonlinear. You may see something which makes you think of something, and you will never be able to figure out what the connection is. It's just sparked something that makes you think, okay, now I get it. And if you stay at home in front of your screen, talking to the same people on the same subjects over and over again, you radically reduce the likelihood of that happening. Now, it may be a very efficient way to get work done, but it's definitely not a particularly good way to solve hard problems or to invent something productive, useful, delightful. I mean, I think, you know, people always ask me, where did I get the idea for a book from? And the answer is, in most cases, I can pretty much pinpoint it. But I know that point I only reach by wandering through some very, very squirrely paths and some very crooked roads, right? I mean, Uncharted started when I read this nerdy data point of, you know, sort of thing I'm pretty fond of, that said, you know, we can't really, unless you're one of the world's greatest forecasters, you can't see with any degree of reliability further out than about 150 days. And it just stuck in my head. Now, I can't remember what book I was reading that told me that. And I don't know why I was reading it, because it's not the sort of thing I was very interested in, but I became very interested in it. So I think what this all adds up to is that to be creative requires allowing yourself to have a great deal of mental freedom, to follow your nose, to go places because you just want to, trusting that somewhere in there is a reason, trusting your instinct. I mean, today I needed to go into a meeting in Bath, and I kind of didn't want to, because I thought it would be so much more productive if I can have the whole day at home. But I thought, well, you know, I said I would, and I do what I say I'm going to do. And at this meeting, I met someone I didn't know was going to be there, who I had no idea existed in the world. And we had a 5-10 minute conversation. And she told me about this thing in Belgium called the Museum of Doubt. And my head exploded. I thought, oh my God, what an incredible idea. You know, so then I started reading up on it. And then I thought, oh, this is really, really helpful to a project I'm working on. Now, there's no way that would have happened if I hadn't thought this meeting this morning. I don't really know what it's about, but it's with people who are always interesting. So I'll turn up anyway. Not efficient.
So true.
But brilliant. And I think everybody who does creative work in whatever sector has that experience, that the road to get there is all over the place. And if you just follow Google Maps, you won't get there.
Yeah. That's a great quote that right there. I saw Annie Lennox talking recently, and she was talking about exactly that, about half the time you don't know why you're writing a song or what it's for. You certainly don't know where it's going to go,
Yeah.
but you start to
Well,
trust it. And
well, and even to the degree that I often don't know on some level what my books are about until people who've read them tell me what they got out of them. And this is, Toni Morrison, to whom I wouldn't dare compare myself, but, she talks about readers as co-conspirators, that actually the book doesn't exist until somebody reads it. And what they read is some kind of co-creation between the author and the reader. And therefore, everyone reads a different book.
which is a perfect moment to go to our desert island, which was the first one on your list, the desert island. And because I think this is about the solitude and the reflection and the recharging. So it's all very well to wander around the streets and take in lots of information. For anybody who's wondering, how does that become a thing? How do I know where to go next? I feel like that point of coming back in and centering and having an instinct about things is very important. And I'd be interested to hear your perspective on that.
Well, it's funny because I do, lots of speaking engagements. I work with lots of different people. And I think I'm, fairly gregarious and sociable. But I can't be that if I don't have quite a big chunk of time alone. So I think I manifest as an extrovert, but actually I'm an introvert.
What would you say
And
your ratio? Do you build it in? Do you have do you know when you're approaching your limits?
yeah, definitely. Partly because I get very grumpy and anxious, for sure. But I think it's also that I need to have peace and quiet to understand what all this stuff I've been receiving is telling me. So one of the habits I adopted was, I go to and from London quite a bit, was thinking the first 15 minutes I'm on that train, I need to just look out the window and think, what happened today? What happened? And I always do it with a, pen and paper, because all sorts of stuff bubbles up, comments, people, contradictions, whatever. And if I don't do that, it's like you've eaten a lot of food and you haven't digested it. So I need quite a lot of time to myself. And it's interesting because I don't particularly espouse or believe in the concept of work-life balance. I don't think I've ever experienced such a thing. I think if you looked at my life as a whole, you might see that it was, fallow periods and hyperdynamic periods, but not across a day, a week, a month, or even a year. I mean, I would say between leaving broadcasting and going into tech, at least 18 months elapsed when I was pretty fundamentally not doing anything. I would say the same was true when I left broadcasting. I would say the same was true when I left tech. And I would say the same is sort of becoming true right now, in the sense that there's some things I want to do that are very different. And I can't quite figure out how to do them. But what I know is if I rush it, it won't be worth it. And, Sebastian Barry, again, not someone to whom I would dare compare myself, but he talks very wonderfully about how this period of kind of fallowness can be really frightening, because I mean, I know, he knows that eventually something comes, but what if this time it doesn't?
Yeah.
What if this time it's just, right, Margaret, you're just written out. You just have nothing else to say.
Yeah.
And the tendency is, well, I better get going and really, knock something out. And so it requires a great degree of patience, and I would say even courage to say, no, actually, if you're not ready, you're not ready. Just trust the process. It'll be okay. And some days that's great. And some days I think,
Well, because
and
the
some
desert
days I
island by
wake.
its nature is lonely, right? It's you are alone, and also there's
Yeah,
that. Sorry, what were you going to
but at
say?
least, well, the desert island, at least you're alone, which means you can scream, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, that idea of reflection, and it all sounds very calm. I like the idea that actually sometimes it's just like winter, everything's underground, and you're just like screaming into the air,
Yeah,
wondering if spring will come.
yeah, yeah. And you're scrabbling in the earth looking for some roots to chew on,
But the
for
boldness, I
sure.
think what you spoke about at the beginning, and again, if you're listening linearly, you'll be able to do that, but maybe not. The boldness of jumping out and off, I think, is really interesting. That kind of
Mm,
decision of like, actually, I have to leave this merry little band behind, or this thing that
yeah,
is currently going and feels good. I've
yeah.
got to move away from that. And I guess that brings us to the last island, which is collaboration and the social island,
Mm,
which, and I think my own experience of this is where I've had really intense, good music collaborations, for example, they have always come to an end for whatever reason.
yes,
Like there's always been a reason. And I heard Annie Lennox talking about this as well. Like sometimes you just, it ends, and
yeah,
everyone knows it, and it's very, very hard to leave. And so I'd be interested in your experience of that,
yeah,
of kind of feeling like you're in your groove and then going, oh, I've got to step out now.
yeah. Well, I absolutely agree with your description, because I can remember I worked with a brilliant woman named Pam Esty, who was my chief creative officer in all of my tech companies. And I mean, she is one of the most creative people I've ever known in my life. Just brilliant beyond my ability to describe it. And there are days I pine for that relationship. But she's gone on to other things, and I've gone on to other things. And I still feel deeply connected to her. But it's gone.
Mm,
I mean, I certainly I am, I move towards people whom I sense to be very creative. And, you just start to sense people who give your brain more freedom to roam as you're working with them.
mm,
And I would say there are a couple of people I'm working with at the moment whom I just adore. And it's making this whole transition period a lot easier, because I know they know what it's like.
mm,
And what will emerge from it and what we will cook up together, I don't know, but I have a great confidence that we will come up with something, and we will hang in there until we do. So it's a
mm.
really interesting phenomenon, I think, because actually this is strange. And I thought about it this way before. So thank you for a great question. The trust has come before the action. I trust them implicitly more than I can prove
Mm.
that it'll work. I can't say, well, we did this and therefore. I just have an instinctive belief that something's going to happen, and I'll stick at it. Now, I may be wrong, and at some point I may think, actually, I've been nursing this plant for 12 years, I think it's time to walk away. But I don't think so. And so it's an interesting thing about collaboration, which is often the trust comes before the demonstration. I think you probably would see that in the
Yes.
history of General Idea, this fabulous, fabulous Canadian collaborative, where I think they just sort of had a sort of mind meld out of which the work came. It isn't
Mm,
that they did the work and the mind meld followed. And they were
mm.
still very different people from each other.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah. Food for thought.
Yeah,
Because I think,
because I
well, I
think
think because
people
when
often want. I
they
think
want to,
people
they want
often
to
want the
recreate the
food first.
family. They want to kind of go, we're in it forever. We're all friends. I think that's exactly right. And I think there's a very specific thing that means that people are able to be themselves and collaborate. It's very unusual. Uh, yeah. And takes a
Well,
sort
look at
of,
the Beatles. Look at the Beatles. Of course, could be fabulously productive together for a while. Doesn't mean they had to be that way forever. And you see this with lots and lots of artists in every, in every area.
well, and I found it
Because
very
artists
interesting.
want to move on. Creative people want to move on. They don't want to keep repeating themselves. And so, eventually everyone's going to kind of reconfigure.
And I think it's interesting, that idea of building teams. So you said you had a COO, was she?
CCO.
Pam,
Yeah.
CCO,
Yeah.
who you kind of loved and took with you. I've definitely noticed in different organizations, like there's the kind of VC concept of like, let's get the best of the best and put them together. I'm like, that's a terrible idea. That's just, I mean, I know nothing, but my instinct
Yeah.
is like, sometimes you just need to get people who trust you to help you with the process. And there's something about that, but also diversity in that, I guess, going back to what you were speaking about before. You don't want everyone who's nodding along.
Well, also, we know from open innovation platforms and also from the nature of complexity that expertise isn't always the key ingredient. So, and I saw this a lot when I was working in tech. We'd have a really hard problem. We couldn't figure out how to solve it. And somebody, often from, if it was a tech problem, it might be somebody from marketing. It might even be somebody from finance, who'd say, well, what if we thought about it this way? And suddenly you think, oh my God. And this is absolutely true of complexity. And I would say creativity is inherently complex. Certainly a lot of technology is, inherently complex. That, the notion of the dream team being massive amounts of expertise is just, it's just naive. It's people who've read about it, but they haven't been in the room at the time. That where the breakthroughs come from can be very, very random.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I mean, thank you so much for, I don't know, it's interesting. I'm wondering, given that this is the first time we've done this, we've kind of taken this route through these different places. It hasn't necessarily been places in your life, but I feel like it has been themes that have kept you going. And it's certainly, I found it very illuminating in terms of that there might be, just as you get the choice to hop off on different islands, if you're on a boat and you're like, oh, I quite like the look of that one. What you've affirmed is, yeah, let's go with that. Actually, let's have more of that in our lives, in our work. I could talk to you forever, but I can't, because we need to respect our listeners. But I wanted to end up perfectly. Because obviously the sea theme is very Greek, and I asked you to give me a piece of music that was that sort of felt like home, because again, that idea of the Odyssey is you go on your journey and then you return home. And I love that piece around the nostalgia is the pain of returning home and seeing it differently, which I think, interestingly, you've totally tied into that idea of where you are in your life now. So I'm going to play us out, and I'll probably do this with the actual music, but with the first track from, is it Nick Bicât and the RSC
Nick
Greek?
So it's Nick Bicât.
Nick
You
Bicât.
don't
And
pronounce
I'd
the
love
T.
to know just a little bit about this, why you chose it, before I play it.
Well, it was kind of interesting. So Nick is a very, very, very old friend of mine. He is a fantastic composer, absolutely brilliant composer. And we've worked together on various projects. But before I met him, I went to see a phenomenal production done. And this must have been in the 1970s. I mean, it's a long, 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 long time ago. But it was a production of called The Greeks, done by the Royal Shakespeare Company, smushed together by John Barton, which brings together all the kind of Greek dramas around the Trojan War and turned it into a sort of all-day epic. And I remembered the music from it, years before I met Nick. And it, like much of his music, it stuck in my head. Now I have a pretty good musical memory, but still, it stayed there for a long time. And it coincided with, my family moving to England, my going to the theater for the first time, my seeing Shakespeare for the first time and thinking, my God, this is the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life, and becoming totally hooked on the theater, which made me completely determined that the place I had to go to was Cambridge, which I did. And, years later, I run into Nick Bicât because he's doing a radio musical with the man who became my first husband. And we've stayed friends ever since. He is godfather to our children. He's continued to write brilliant music, and he's continued to innovate. And so it just seemed to tie together lots of things that really mattered to me. And it's funny because I haven't listened to this music for quite a long time now. I was delighted to find it was on Spotify, because the last time I listened to it was on a cassette tape. And I just thought, well, here we are. It's on Spotify. Isn't that incredible? So it sort of tied up everything. And this is it.
And this is Owlis. It's the first track. I found it absolutely beautiful to listen to. And it definitely feels like returning home to some amazing Greek island that we don't know what it's called.
Exactly.